Let's imagine that the situation with Russia takes a catastrophic turn. Vladimir Putin, desperate and unstable, sees his regime on the brink of collapse. In a final act of madness, he decides to drag as many enemies as possible into his downfall and orders a massive launch of the Russian nuclear arsenal against the West. The silos open, releasing hundreds or even thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles equipped with nuclear warheads, traveling at a speed of 24,000 kilometers per hour. But where are they headed? Fortunately, such a scenario remains extremely unlikely. However, it cannot be entirely ruled out. Russia possesses the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, with nearly 6,000 warheads, of which about 1,600 are actively deployed. The question of where these weapons could strike in the event of a launch has been a concern for experts and policymakers since the Cold War era. Today, as nuclear threats resurface, it is pertinent to examine how such an apocalyptic scenario might unfold. In this video, we will analyze the potential targets of a Russian nuclear attack, starting with the United States. The first potential targets of a Russian nuclear strike on American soil would naturally include the main centers of power. The Pentagon, at the top of the list, is a major strategic target as it houses the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. If Russia were to damage or destroy this facility, it would deal a severe blow to the American military command chain. While this would not completely paralyze the United States Armed Forces, it would cause significant disruptions, greatly complicating the organization of a response. The magnitude of a nuclear explosion and its fallout would mean that a strike on the Pentagon would also devastate a large part of Washington, D.C. The capital has about 713,000 residents, while over 6.3 million people live in its metropolitan area. Projections for such an attack estimate that around 500,000 people would be killed instantly, while many others would suffer from the effects of radioactive fallout. The initial explosion would vaporize the Pentagon and everything within an 800-meter radius. The damage would extend up to 6.5 kilometers around the epicenter, affecting iconic places like the Capitol, the White House, and the Supreme Court. While the nuclear fireball and shockwave would be deadly on their own, it is the massive spread of radiation that would pose the most formidable danger. Radiation near the impact point would be intense enough to cause third-degree burns, while causing severe DNA mutations in victims, leading to cellular degeneration and cancers. Even those who survive the initial explosion would have a high chance of succumbing to the effects of acute exposure to extreme radiation. The White House, located about 3.5 kilometers from the Pentagon, would fall well within the destruction zone of a nuclear explosion. If the president were present, he would likely be killed by the power of the shockwave, even if the White House or the Capitol were not directly targeted. Thousands of federal officials and employees would also perish, causing a major crisis within the government. The president, if he survived, would likely declare a state of emergency and impose martial law. In the event the president is killed, the line of succession provides that power would transfer to the vice president, followed by the Speaker of the House, the president pro tempore of the Senate, then the Secretary of State, and so on, until a living person can take the reins of government. In addition to the institutions around Washington, D.C., the second main objective of a Russian nuclear attack would be to destroy as many American missile silos as possible to reduce retaliatory capabilities. However, it is almost impossible for such an attempt to be entirely successful, as the United States possesses an almost equivalent nuclear arsenal to Russia's. In addition to sophisticated early warning systems, nuclear submarines hidden around the globe, and powerful air defense systems. Despite this, Russia would seek to neutralize as many silos as possible, notably targeting bases housing the Minuteman III ICBMs, which would involve targeting very isolated regions of American territory. One of the strategic bases that could be targeted is Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. This base employs about 3,400 military personnel and 1,000 civilians, managing the 150 Minuteman III missiles it houses. A Russian nuclear strike on Malmstrom would likely kill all personnel present, as well as around 15,000 residents of nearby towns like Black Eagle and Great Falls. The number of injured would be almost twice as high, although the region is relatively sparsely populated. That said, the main objective of an attack on Malmstrom would not be to cause massive human casualties, but rather to neutralize the operational capabilities of the deployed ICBMs. Additionally, the environmental consequences of such a strike would be absolutely catastrophic for the region. The water of the Mississippi River, located near the impact site, would be instantly vaporized, while upstream waterways would carry radioactive particles throughout the region. The river, along with the surrounding ecosystems, would remain contaminated for months or even years. In the meantime, abundant wildlife would perish due to radioactive poisoning, even hundreds of kilometers from the explosion. The ecological consequences of such an event would be felt nationwide, yet Malmstrom is just one of many potential targets of a Russian nuclear attack. Another strategic base likely to be targeted is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. This base also houses 150 Minuteman III missiles and employs around 3,200 military personnel and 420 civilians. However, the city of Minot is much more populated, with nearly 50,000 residents. A nuclear strike on this base could cause more than 23,000 immediate deaths, while about 20,000 others would suffer injuries and severe radiation exposure. Like Malmstrom, an attack on Minot would also result in considerable environmental damage, with radioactive fallout contaminating groundwater, soil, and air over a wide area. The last ICBM base that Russia might target in an initial strike would be Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The missiles at this base are a more complex target, as they are dispersed in silos spread across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. With similar personnel and missile numbers to Malmstrom and Minot, an attack here could cause over 25,000 casualties. The city of Cheyenne, Wyoming, would also suffer massive destruction, and anyone present would be exposed to extremely high radiation doses, making the situation even more catastrophic. In addition to the main silos, a Russian nuclear attack would also target command and control centers dispersed across the country, often located in rural areas. Among these targets, the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, headquarters at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, would be a key objective. NORAD, a joint organization of the American and Canadian Armed Forces, is responsible for the aerospace defense of North America. Peterson Base houses over 8,700 active military personnel, 1,300 reservists, 1,900 civilian employees, as well as 10,000 family members and over 20,000 veterans. Located near Colorado Springs, a city of about 500,000 residents, a nuclear strike in this area would likely cause more than 60,000 immediate deaths and leave 200,000 injured or irradiated. The massive contamination of water, air, and soil would render much of the region uninhabitable, while winds would carry radioactive fallout to Kansas and other neighboring states. Another major strategic target would be Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha, Nebraska. This base houses the headquarters of the United States Strategic Command, STRATCOM, which oversees strategic nuclear deterrence, global strikes, and the management of the Department of Defense's Global Information Network. A nuclear strike on Offutt could result in the deaths of over 40,000 people and injure 150,000 others. Such an event would significantly weaken the United States' ability to coordinate a military response, plunging the armed forces command structure into chaos. Additionally, the neighboring city of Omaha would be largely destroyed, potentially causing hundreds of thousands of additional deaths. The Missouri River, running through the region, would be severely contaminated, leading to massive wildlife deaths and a significant reduction in local biodiversity. If STRATCOM were destroyed by a nuclear strike, command would be transferred to one of the 10 other command and control centers located across the country. This new center would oversee preparations for a nuclear counterattack, which could be launched almost immediately, as it would be very difficult for Russia to completely neutralize the American nuclear triad. Another potential target for Russia would be the Cutler VLF, Very Low Frequency Transmitter in Maine. This station transmits unilateral communications to the submarines of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, allowing them to launch strikes if necessary. Operating at a frequency of 24 kilohertz and with a power of only 1.8 megawatts, the system functions at a relatively low rate. By destroying this base, Russia could cut off contact between the United States and its submarines, complicating a potential response. Although direct human losses would be under 1,000, its position on the Atlantic coast would result in major damage to marine life and coastal ecosystems. Cutler has an equivalent in Washington, the Jim Creek Naval Radio Station, which transmits to the submarines of the Pacific Fleet. Located in an isolated area, a strike there would cause few direct human casualties. However, Air and water contamination could reach Seattle and Vancouver, making life in these cities potentially dangerous. Furthermore, the explosion would trigger massive wildfires in Washington state, worsening atmospheric conditions and risks for the population. Hawaii, located about 3,200 kilometers from the American mainland, also represents a strategic target, notably the VLF transmitter on the island of Oahu, which relays orders to the Pacific Fleet in case Jim Creek is destroyed. This transmitter makes Hawaii a priority target as it ensures redundancy in communications. A strike on Oahu would be particularly deadly, as it is the most populous island in the archipelago, with over 1 million residents. Due to its isolation and limited ecosystem, a nuclear attack could render almost the entire island uninhabitable. With few shelters available, residents would find themselves in a desperate situation. Additionally, the presence of naval bases like Pearl Harbor would increase the likelihood of a multi-missile attack, making any evacuation nearly impossible. All these targets represent strategic military installations, but even an attack limited to these positions would cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. A nuclear strike targeting multiple major American cities would be even more catastrophic. If Putin chose to engage in a nuclear war, it is unlikely he would act halfway. Targeting major cities would also destroy the economic power of the United States. In a preventive nuclear war, each side would seek to annihilate the other without the possibility of recovery, which would involve massive attacks against civilians. Such an assault would quickly become the deadliest in history, far surpassing the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Outside of Washington, D.C., New York would be an obvious civilian target. As the financial capital of the United States and the largest city in the country, it also embodies a global symbol of American power. A nuclear explosion in Manhattan would be absolutely devastating. With a length of only 21.6 kilometers, the island is one of the most densely populated areas in the country. An 800-kiloton nuclear warhead could instantly kill between 1.5 and 2 million people, severely injuring another 3 to 5 million. The 5 boroughs of New York, home to nearly 8.5 million residents, would be deeply disrupted. Even those who survived the explosion or fireball could be killed by the 800 kilometers per hour winds generated by the shockwave. An explosion at Times Square, accompanied by the fireball, would create a crater 15 meters deep at the epicenter. The shockwave would extend over a diameter of nearly 5 kilometers, shattering windows as far as Gramercy Park and the American Museum of Natural History. The city's medical infrastructure would collapse in the face of immense needs, especially as many hospitals would be destroyed. Evacuating Manhattan and the other boroughs would be almost impossible, hindered by collapsed buildings, destroyed tunnels and bridges, and the general panic of crowds trying to flee. Additionally, nuclear explosions produce an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, that would disable electronic systems, medical equipment, and the power grid, making rescue efforts even more difficult and significantly worsening casualties. In a nuclear war, Russia would not stop at New York. Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States, would also be an obvious target. Although less densely populated than New York, with about 4 million residents, LA would suffer an equally apocalyptic fate in the event of a nuclear explosion. Between 500,000 and 700,000 people would die instantly, and 1.5 million would be injured. With its famous traffic jams, the city's 5.5 million cars would render the roads impassable as residents attempt to flee radioactive fallout. The region's chronic drought would worsen, leaving millions without access to potable water. In the Midwest, Chicago, with its nearly 3 million residents, would likely be a target. A nuclear explosion in the city could result in the instant death of 500,000 to 600,000 people, with over 1 million seriously injured. A large part of the explosion would affect Lake Michigan, while winds would disperse radioactive fallout to the north, south, and east. The densely populated Great Lakes region would be severely threatened, making a massive evacuation likely necessary. To hope to prevail in a nuclear war, Putin would need to strike massively before the West exceeds Russia's limited defense capabilities. Even a small portion of the Russian nuclear arsenal would suffice to spread radioactive fallout over a large part of the United States, rendering many regions uninhabitable. Being away from impact sites would not guarantee safety, especially in densely populated areas. With 80% of Americans living east of the Mississippi River, A strike on the East Coast would cause particularly high casualties. Projections estimate that a full-scale Russian nuclear attack could result in over 256 million deaths, injuries, or irradiations, which is about 3/4 of the American population. However, an attack against the United States would also expose Russia to retaliations from other NATO members, almost inevitably involving strikes on Europe from the onset of a nuclear conflict. Among the likely targets is Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which plays a key role in coordinating NATO's air and missile defense networks. A strike on Ramstein could cause the deaths of 30,000 people, with radioactive fallout carried by winds across the continent. A retaliatory attack could also annihilate Moscow, making these European targets risky for Putin, as some fallout could return to the Kremlin. Other potential military targets would include NATO's Allied Command operations in Belgium, a key strategic center, as well as American bases in Europe, such as Caserma Ederle in Italy, which houses the powerful 173rd Airborne Brigade of the United States. Strategic or economically important cities in Europe could also be targeted. London, the most populous city in Western Europe with over 8.8 million residents, is an ideal target. The United Kingdom, with about 200 nuclear weapons, is a high-risk country. A nuclear explosion in London would instantly kill over 1 million people, and total casualties, due to the shockwave and radiation, could exceed 2.3 million. As the capital, London would also lose its government, and its vital infrastructures would be obliterated, making any emergency intervention almost impossible. Coastal winds from the Atlantic could carry radiation to Scotland, the Western United Kingdom, France, and other regions of continental Europe. In summary, any modern nuclear strike would create a nightmarish scenario. Although this hypothetical scenario is extremely unlikely, it is clear that if it were to occur, no satisfactory solution would exist. The concept of mutually assured destruction, which has prevented nuclear war since the 1950s, has left governments like that of the United States terribly unprepared to handle such consequences. As a recent article in New York Magazine highlighted, over 70 years ago, America became the first and only country to use nuclear weapons in wartime. Despite the immediate and lasting horrors of these attacks, and despite decades of technological advancements in nuclear warfare, the United States remains surprisingly unprepared to face a similar attack on its own territory. Much of the immediate response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, based on plans designed for other types of disasters. Putin knows that launching even a single nuclear weapon would likely signal the end of his reign, and perhaps even that of Russia. However, the reality remains. These weapons exist and could, in theory, be used at any time in the future. In an increasingly uncertain world, it would be wise for governments around the globe to strengthen their preparations against a nuclear threat, as the future remains unpredictable. But what do you think? What would, in your opinion, be the potential targets of a Russian nuclear attack? And to what extent is the world truly unprepared for this eventuality, even if it remains unlikely? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to discover more content and analyses on military issues.